great pictures from this old anatomy book. Here's a view of the sphenoid bone and other parts of the cranium. You can see the optic foramina there, and the optic chiasma, and the internal carotid arteries right there. What's right underneath that optic chiasma? The pituitary and the sella turcica would be right underneath that, wouldn't it? So your optic nerve goes out to the eyeball, and here's one of the muscles that controls eye movement, and there's another one, there's another one, but you can't see them all. But we'll be talking about the muscles that control eye movement tonight, because 3 of the cranial nerves control eye movement. Okay? So that's a really neat picture. And so if I point to that and mention that this cranial nerve is involved in vision, you'll just kick yourself if you miss it. That's the optic nerve, number 2. But nobody will miss it. So, anyone guess what this next one down would be numbered?
3.
3, yeah. And this one over here is 4. Okay, let's look at number 3. A very important cranial nerve in the control of eye movement. Okay, the optic nerve's also predominantly sensory, a few pain neurons. Guess I wasn't done with that. Okay, so number 3 is the oculomotor nerve. Okay, and it controls a whole bunch of muscles involved in eye movement. The only important one that it doesn't control is the lateral rectus muscle. The lateral rectus muscle, when it contracts, pulls your eye to the outside. Okay, and you see how that would happen? If those muscles get shorter, they'll pull your eye, your line of sight will be pulled to the outside. And the oculomotor nerve doesn't control that. But it certainly controls movement to the inside, and also movement up and movement down. It controls the superior, inferior, and medial rectus muscles. So it's involved in moving your eyes inward, which is very important. As an object moves closer to your eyes, your line of focus starts moving inward. And that's automatically controlled. We never know it by the oculomotor nerve. And moving the eye up and down. And the oculomotor nerve also controls levator palpebrae superioris, which controls your upper eyelid. Okay, and so that's an important one too. Palpebrae means eyelid. So that's your oculomotor nerve. And here are the rectus muscles, the so-called extrinsic muscles of the eye involved in eye movement. There are 6 of them. There are 4, the superior, inferior, medial, and lateral, that control pretty obvious movements. But then you have 2 of them that are kind of go through little pulleys, and it's kind of hard to imagine. Contraction of this would sort of want to pull your eye inward and maybe rotate it even a little bit. Kind of hard to imagine why we need that. But it's also controlled by the oculomotor. This is the superior oblique muscle. The inferior oblique muscle, no, pardon me, this superior one is not controlled by the oculomotor. It's the inferior one that is. Minor point, really. Okay, another picture of the extrinsic muscles, and this is the top view showing the superior oblique, and the superior rectus pulls your eye up, and the lateral rectus pulls it out to the outside, the medial rectus pulls it in to the inside, and the inferior rectus pulls it down so that you'd be looking down. So the oculomotor controls the superior rectus, the inferior rectus, the medial rectus, but not the lateral rectus, very importantly. And one thing that we want to focus on is what happens if one of these cranial nerves is dysfunctional. That's why nurses are interested in this after all, is that there are all kinds of clinical conditions that are the result of paralyzed or dysfunctional cranial nerves. And so we'll be talking about some of those problems tonight. And if you've got a problem with the oculomotor nerve, you'll tend to exhibit what's called external strabismus. You'll lose that medial muscle tension, muscle tone. You won't have any muscle tone from the medial muscles, but yet the lateral muscles, which are controlled by some other cranial nerve, which is working fine, will be pulling the eye out, so you'll have external strabismus. Strabismus is a condition where your eyes aren't looking where they're supposed to be, and so your eyes, rather strangely, will be pointing outward like that. And there are drugs they can use, some of them kind of nasty drugs, I think, but there are some pharmaceutical and surgical treatments for this, but external strabismus wouldn't be a nice condition to have.
Which one would you lose to have a lazy eye or?
It'd be a problem, it depends on how the eye's lazy. I mean, what direction is it pointing?
So my son has strabismus and he had a deformed optic nerve and his eye went that way.
Uh-huh.
So,
How?
yeah, would it be that nerve?
It would probably be a problem with, sounds like oculomotor to me,
Okay.
yeah.
And then- But this, so they operated on it twice to
Uh-huh.
bring it in, but they couldn't do it again because they can't cut the blood supply, so they overcorrected his good eye to make his brain,
It's,
does that make sense? I
it's,
mean,
the way, any surgical remedy to this is gonna be a little bit iffy, it
it
seems
was
to me.
weird, I mean, but they literally took his good eye and made it go off, so. his brain
You
and
can
pulled it
compensate
together.
by, increasing the tension on the other
So is
side.
that affecting the nerves, so they work together with the brain? Is that what-
Probably not,
It's just muscle?
hard to say, they're just dealing with the muscle.
Okay, I was just wondering.
It'd be a lot safer to deal with the muscle in some way
Okay.
than to try and alter the function of the nerve. You know, a lot more straightforward if you could do that. One technique might just be to shorten the muscle,
Yeah.
and so that it would pull more, say if you were pointing outwards, to shorten the medial muscle, so it would tend to pull it inwards a little bit,
Yeah.
yeah. But not being, you know, an ophthalmic surgeon, I should leave it up to them. Okay. So the oculomotor nerve controls these that we've mentioned. Most importantly, really, the medial rectus muscle, although moving your eye up and down is very important. But this is the one you should remember when it comes to, you know, clinical conditions that result from this dysfunction of this muscle. Okay, so you'll get the eyes pointing to the outside, and which the technical name is external strabismus. You could call it lazy eye or whatever you wanted to. Of course, lazy eye isn't very specific. So, a drooping upper eyelid would also be evidence because remember, the old oculomotor nerve controls the upper eyelid. So this is a pretty important nerve. Okay, and there it is. I had to really hunt for this nerve on our model over there. In fact, one of my students finally dug it up. I'd sort of given up on it. I thought they made a mistake. You won't believe where this is. It comes out in between the pons and the midbrain. And it's really hidden in our model. So what one do you think we're gonna talk about next?
Number 4,
Number 4, which is where?
just down,
They're gonna be lateral, yeah, that one. And that one, you may recall, number 4 comes from around the backside. It's the only one that comes around through the backside. In oculomotor paralysis, the eye moves laterally at rest. External strabismus. Okay, so we beat that to death. So there it is again, different picture, and we're leaving out the lateral rectus. That's the only one that isn't innervated by this one. So finally, now we do the trochlear nerve, and the only muscle that's innervated by this is the superior oblique muscle. And it seems to me that we could almost do without the superior oblique muscle and still live a fairly normal life, but I could be wrong. So that only, the trochlear nerve, which comes from around the backside, only controls one of these many muscles of eye movement. Okay, so there it is, actually comes from around the backside. So, if you can imagine what an inferolateral eye movement consists of, you can't do that anymore if you have trochlear dysfunction. So, inferolaterally, kind of down and out. Okay, so there it is. Seems to me it would be superior, not infero. Okay, one of the real biggies of the 12 cranial nerves is the trigeminal nerve. It is physically the largest of the 12 cranial nerves, and it splits into 3 branches, which you will want to know, because I'll ask them on the quiz next time. Okay, and there is the ophthalmic branch, which comes out through the supraorbital fissure. You'll want to know the holes that these branches pass through. Okay, and this innervates basically deep facial structures like muscles and things like that. So deep facial structures, both sensory and motor. The muscles of chewing are innervated by the mandibular branch, which comes out through the foramen ovale, okay? And the maxillary branch, which innervates the maxillary region, including your upper teeth, and the nose, but not olfactory function, just, you know. If someone hits you in the nose, you'll feel it through this muscle, okay? And so you see the cranial nerve 5, the Roman numeral for 5 is a V. And we indicate the 3 branches with V1, V2, and V3. And you should be able to do that. This is the ophthalmic branch, the maxillary branch, and the mandibular branch. You should know which hole each branch passes through on its way out. The supraorbital fissure, the foramen rotundum, and the foramen ovale. That's what those holes are for. Okay? And not only does this mandibular branch innervate your lower teeth, but it also innervates the muscles of chewing. The pterygoid muscles, the masseter, and the temporalis muscle. And the digastric muscle, which opens your mouth, you may recall. So that's a lot of good information. It's a very important nerve, and the largest of the 12 cranial nerves. Hard to miss, comes right out of the center of the pons. Okay, so we have the ophthalmic branch, V1. So right here's the information you should know about these 3 branches. So we have no model I can point to show you these. So if I ask you these, I'll have to give you a real good verbal description. Okay? So I'm likely to say that this branch, important nerve branch, innervates the muscles of chewing. and passes through the foramen ovale. And then you should write down on your paper, mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve, V3. Get the idea?
And that's gonna be on our next step.
Okay, if I say this one innervates eye structures, deep eye structures, and passes out through the supraorbital fissure, you'll say the ophthalmic branch of the trigeminal nerve, V1. Okay.
Put the input of the trigeminal nerve.
You can ask that during the quiz and I'll say whether or not I want of the, yeah. I mean, once you write trigeminal nerve once, I mean, you know, so. I probably will have already asked you trigeminal nerve, so, you know. Good question though. Okay, so that's the good information right there, the stuff I would be telling you. And here's a great picture, and one of the words I was gonna write on the blackboard that we're adding to the lab is, here we have the sensory root, one of the roots of the trigeminal nerve, and all the roots of the trigeminal nerve come together in this big structure called the semilunar ganglion. So I was gonna write semilunar ganglion, and if I show you this picture, what should you write on your quiz? Semilunar ganglion. Okay, and then you could see V1, what branch is that? The ophthalmic branch. Watch the spelling of ophthalmic, it's really tricky. O-P-H-T-H. This is the maxillary branch. What's the hole? Name the hole. Foramen rotundum, very good. And here's the mandibular branch. What's that hole? Foramen ovale, yeah. So lots of good stuff here. We see the pituitary stalk right there, because we've cut the optic chiasma so you can see underneath it to the pituitary. Here we see the internal carotid arteries and the posterior cerebral arteries back here. All kinds of really cool anatomy. Here we see, this is interesting, I never noticed this before. This is where the falx cerebri attaches to the crista galli, right there, and anchors the brain. That's neat, I never knew I even had a picture of that. So this is a really neat picture. This is back here is the 4 bumps, the corpora quadrigemina. I have to remember that, that's kind of neat. This is your typical cluttered netter picture, if you really want to know everything, which I'm not sure I do right now anyway. And so, okay, and so the largest of the 12 cranial nerves is the trigeminal nerve, nerve 5, and we see its 3 branches. Okay, it comes right out of the middle of the pons, can't miss it. Inflammation of this nerve causes a very painful condition called tic de la Rue. And very, very painful chronic, I think there's some drugs for that these days. But typically the drugs you find for the treatment of so many of these neurological maladies, the drugs themselves are almost worse than the malady in so often, in so many cases. Okay, so which branch is involved in chewing? Well, it would be that one, wouldn't it? The mandibular branch. And there's the maxillary branch. And there's the ophthalmic branch. Muscles of chewing, mandibular branch. You should know that. I could just show you this picture and ask, which branch? Name the nerve branch. Which branch of the trigeminal nerve passes through the foramen rotundum, I could ask you. And you would write, what's the name of that branch? Maxillary branch. Okay, so here we have innervation of deep facial structures, and we sort of see the pattern of innervation. And here we're showing sensory innervation, but motor would be roughly in similar regions. So that is the all-important trigeminal nerve. We get finally to the other nerve that controls eye movement, the abducens. Cranial nerve 6 controls the lateral rectus muscle. So can you guess, if you have a dysfunction of this nerve, what are your eyes gonna do?
Go in. Internal,
Will they point?
inward.
They won't be pointing straight ahead anymore. If you lose the use of this lateral rectus muscle,
Cross.
which way are they gonna point?
Ian?
They'll point medially, won't they? You'll still have muscle tone in the medial muscle, which will be pulling your eyes medially. So you'll lose that lateral muscle tone. So which you'll have nothing to offset the medial muscle tone. So the medial rectus muscle will pull the eyes medially. So you'll get medial, or internal strabismus. So the abducens nerve innervates the lateral rectus muscle. So these are the nerves of eye movement. Are they motor or sensory?
Sensory.
Almost strictly motor. They control eye movement. Eye movement, as you can see, is very sophisticated. And internal strabismus is the dysfunction that results from paralysis of the abducens muscle. You have difficulty moving the eye laterally. It's difficult, if not impossible. So you lose the use of the lateral rectus muscle. Okay, so there is the abducens muscle. So we move from the trigeminal down to this level between the pons and the medulla oblongata. And there are a whole bunch of nerves at this level that come out right there. And so we number medial to lateral. So we're gonna number 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so here are all the muscles of eye movement, all in one picture, which of course you know who drew that would be Netter. Just have to show it all. Okay. So internal strabismus. The dysfunction, so I will always point to a stub on the brainstem over there when I'm asking you about these nerves. Students find that very helpful, but for extra credit questions, I won't point to the stubs. I'll just give you verbal cues. And so I could say, if a person exhibited internal strabismus, which would be the problem nerve? Which cranial nerve would be causing that problem? Dysfunction of which cranial nerve would lead to internal strabismus? And you give me a name and a number, that kind of thing. So, and I might show you a picture too, because as a matter of fact, I will, because I've already got them figured out. So. Okay, so now we get to the facial nerve. And so we saw how the trigeminal nerve innervated deep facial structures. The facial nerve innervates superficial facial structures. Okay, like the muscles of facial expression would account for a lot of those. And there are actually 5 branches of the facial nerve. They don't have little sub-numbers, they just have names. And I will expect you to know the 5 branches, but they're pretty easy, really. This is a rotten picture here. Okay, the facial nerve is both sensory and motor. We actually even get a little bit of taste information along the facial nerve. Okay, this is a little better, but not great. Cervical, There are 5 branches: the cervical, mandibular, buccal, zygomatic, and temporal. So this could be called zygomatic as well, it seems to me, more than that. I think they actually kind of mislabeled it myself, because that's the zygomatic region. This is more the buccal region.
Which one moves the eyebrows?
Eyebrows, probably this one. And there you see a more detailed picture: temporal branch, zygomatic branch, she goes through the zygomatic region, buccal branch, mandibular branch, and cervical branch. That's really a pretty good picture. That's the most accurate and unambiguous picture. I can't use that in a question because there's no way I can delete those little words out of there. But that's a good one to look at, just to see 5 names. So these are branches of the facial nerve. Okay, I always like that picture. Okay, that kind of is pretty unambiguous. And that's what I always think about when I'm thinking of the 5 regions. I just visualize a hand against the face. Okay. And so there it is, number 6, number 7. Paralysis, maybe you've heard of Bell's palsy. It's actually caused by a virus that belongs to the herpes family. And these herpes viruses have the diabolical capability of entering neurons from the distal end of the neuron and traveling up the axons and lying dormant in the nerve cell bodies, and then raising Cain later on in various episodes. And there are all kinds of examples of viruses that can move up genital herpes. Genital herpes can do the same thing. And rabies virus does the same thing. A number of these viruses that enter the distal end of neurons and travel up the axon. Boy, rabies virus is a very diabolical one. I've known a couple people who have done research on it, and they were scared to death all the time. Okay, so the facial nerve branches: temporal, zygomatic, probably buccal, mandibular, cervical. So, the nerve that carries information from the inner ear, the vestibule and the cochlea, is appropriately called the vestibulocochlear nerve. Cranial nerve 8, totally sensory, pretty much. Might carry a few pain fibers. Okay. But since this nerve comes entirely from the inner ear, like any pain you'd get from the eardrum would come in some other pathway besides this.
Like when you ear infection, where
Probably you just get it from nerves around here. Yeah, and ear infections are very painful. Depending on how invasive the ear infection was into these structures. Boy, you're in a world of hurt if you start getting inflammation inside here.
Is in there somewhere that sends a balance?
Absolutely. I've been preparing for the winter course, and I keep subconsciously thinking we've talked about this already, when indeed we're gonna talk about it. Okay. So, and all of these structures in the inner ear are within the petrous ridge of the temporal bone. So here we see the organ of hearing, the organ of equilibrium. And to actually see them, you have to saw into the bone. And so that's cranial nerve 8. Here we have 6, 7, and 8, vestibulocochlear. And you don't wanna have a problem with that nerve, or you'll, manifest what's called Meniere's disease. And not a nice condition to have. Meniere's disease, extreme ringing of the ears, or some people just hear a loud sound that sounds like ocean waves, and they have extreme vertigo and ocean waves. If God help you if you have tinnitus, really loud. A couple famous people had this back in the couple hundred years ago, and it actually drove them mad. I forget, some famous author or musician or somebody. So, I know a guy here in Brookings that has been diagnosed with it.
They're
Okay,
doing studies
so
up on it.
the
in Portland.
vestibulocochlear nerve, yes?
They're doing studies on tinnitus in Portland, out of Portland.
Yeah.
The VA, and they found that ocean waves actually helps. Like
That
the
would
sound-
help?
Ocean waves?
Oh, they helped.
Playing
Oh,
it
is that
over and
right?
over, It
Huh.
actually helps.
That's interesting. Huh. Okay, so that was number 8. Number 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve. Glosso means tongue, pharynx is your throat. So this innervates the tongue and throat region, is both sensory and motor. We receive a good deal of taste information along this nerve, but it also exhibits some motor function, controlling both the tongue and the throat in swallowing. Okay? So the glossopharyngeal nerve, number 9. Okay? So, tongue and throat region. Lots of innervation of the pharynx. Okay, so there it is, cranial nerve 9. Okay. Dysphagia is the medical word for difficulty swallowing. And you lose some of your sense of taste if you had glossopharyngeal dysfunction. Okay. It also controls your largest salivary gland, the parotid gland. Okay. Finally, the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, is the only cranial nerve to leave the head region. It